You know, when on TV shows, a lot because it feels like in modern like Viking TV shows, there's a much more emphasis on like the farming side of things. What do you think the
Right.
what what do you think the balance was with this? Like how much like just raiding and taking versus like we actually just want to come here and be peaceful and farm and everybody get on? Or was it like we want to farm and get on after we just kind of can't raid anymore because we maybe got beat or for whatever reason? So it's like, oh, well, can we just farm?
We got our asses kicked, so can we
Yeah, it's
farm?
like yeah. Like after it's like okay, let's just come to an agreement and we'll farm rather than turn because in some you see on some it's like it's almost like they turn up and go, let's just make an agreement and farm.
Well, this is actually really, really interesting because just as, you know, if you look at today and how the sensational stuff sells in the press, right? I mean, even though it was on a much smaller scale, surely throughout history, it's always been the same. Like nobody's going to write a book saying, "Oh, it's been another great day of farming," whereas, whereas you know, I mean, wonderful, but you're more likely to write a book about a gruesome battle that just took place. So I'm sure there's so much that's gotten lost, so many aspects of that whole relationship between these different peoples that is just lost because nobody bothered to write it down because they just had a good day.
Yeah, I mean, so there are definitely visionaries involved here in the Viking Age, and we can see Rollo being an example of this in Normandy, because he's like, yeah, I'm going to need some land. And then what we learn, if we read the French sources on him, we learn that he gets a bunch of Scandinavians to show up, and then he partitions land for them. He uses very specific measurements, and they use wheel plow and so on. So it's like that sounds like a visionary, right? If that again, we apply the critical perspective here, we can always ask ourselves, did that actually happen, or is that sort of, you know, a later historian who is like beefing him up a little bit? It probably is to an extent, but also, why would he lie about, you know, him, you know, organizing the land that way? That just seems weird that he would lie about that. And obviously he's not lying about the fact that there is a considerable presence of Scandinavians in Normandy. We know that from place names and vocabulary and so on. So what we can see here is that is an example of somebody who's a visionary, who says, I can now take control over this piece of land, and then people that for some reason or other I am tied to, they get a piece of this land that I just gotten control over. That is the same in England to an extent, right? We see this in what is called the Danelaw. And historically, the Danelaw is again a pretty iffy subject, because we don't actually know what that law actually meant. We don't see a lot of influence on the local English laws from Scandinavian laws. But on the other hand, our sources to Scandinavian laws are pretty poor at this time period. But is there vocabulary that's like shared? Not really, and so on and so forth. So we actually don't really know what it means that they called that, you know, eastern northern part of what is now modern day England, Danelaw. But we do know that there is considerable presence of Scandinavians. There's a ton of place names, linguistic influence. And we also know that various kings at certain times will invoke, you know, the presence of these Scandinavians, usually cast as Danes. But they don't have to necessarily be from the Danish area. They could also be from elsewhere in Scandinavia. They invoke them as a problem, right? It's like pretty similar to what we see sometimes with certain political leaning parties that have opinions about immigrants in Europe to this day. Like similar kind of like, oh, there's like too many of these people over here. that's what we see with the dynamics between the English and the Scandinavians in the early thousands, for instance, which is why there's St. Brice's massacre and all that stuff, right? So yeah, where was I going with this, Dan?
Thinking about coconuts, I bet. Daydreaming about coconuts.
No, it's this matter of like, well, are we actually dealing with like an immigration where these people are coming there because they want to farm better land? And that's probably part of it to an extent, but we have to ask ourselves, what is it that initially like generated an exodus from these homelands that they have over there on the other side? And that is something that's still hotly debated. It's also hotly debated whether or not the Viking Age was like generated because there was an exodus of Scandinavians from Scandinavia. There is something that suggests that there is like a population boom in the Viking Age, because we see these new place names in the Scandinavian region and also in the English region. The Thorpe place names, they mean outlier farms. So that's new farms that are being created in the thousands in particular. That's when they start. And at the same time, we have Scandinavians showing up over there. We have the introduction of the wheel plow in Scandinavia, which will be better for farming, which means that there's more food available, which means that there are more children who survive, which means that there will be probably more people, right? So there's like a bunch of like different factors that come together, and then all of a sudden you see a bunch of people like basically taking land. But did it start with like some guy who was like sitting there on the western coast of Norway going like, this is shitty farmland, I want to go farm somewhere else, and then I have to like fight my way through it? I don't think so. That comes later with some kind of like population development in the late 900s and early thousands.